I was initially very skeptical about embarking on a full life biography of anyone, let alone a figure as big as Zbig. Edward Luce is talking about President Carter's former national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Mr. Luce is the Financial Times chief commentator and columnist. Luce is a native of Sussex, England, and has spent close to 20 years in the United States since the mid-90s. He is an Oxford grad. Zbigniew Brzezinski was born in Warsaw, Poland, got his PhD at Harvard, spent time in Canada during the time his father was posted as Police Consul General in Montreal. Brzezinski was National Security Advisor from 1977 to 1981. Ed Luce, tell me about yourself.
Oh, well, I've been based in Washington, although I'm, from Britain. I've been based in Washington now for 20 years for the Financial Times. I was bureau chief, DC bureau chief, and a columnist in the last few years, but also, a writer of occasional books. But I guess the most unusual feature of my biography is that I was based in DC earlier as a speechwriter to the US Treasury Secretary, then Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, right at the last year of the Clinton administration, which was for a foreigner and a journalist, it was a pretty unique and very interesting job to be doing. I was privileged, I think, to have that opportunity.
How did that happen?
That happened because his previous speechwriter, Stephanie Flanders, had come from the Financial Times, and she, in fact, recommended me. But the interview, his chief of staff, Summers' chief of staff then was Sheryl Sandberg. So the interview was initially with her and then with him. And it's a pretty intimidating gauntlet to run, whether you're from America or not. They're quite tough characters.
Now, in your book on Dr. Brzezinski, you point out that he wasn't the, what word should I use? He was not a quiet man, and neither is Mr. Summers, Dr. Summers. What was it like? What did you take away working for him, trying to write for him?
It's really a very good analogy. And it did occur to me a few times when I was researching Brzezinski's life that they had some overlapping qualities, such as take no prisoners approach to disputes. Summers was a very hard taskmaster because he could do better with a speech just extemporizing, just saying, okay, why don't we put it like this? And then he would start talking and you think, I've just been laboring over this for a day and you've, in 10, 15 minutes, put it way better. So I suppose it's a bit like experiencing ChatGPT 20 years before it came out.
I need to ask you, before we get into Dr. Brzezinski, about your own family. What is a Lord Chamberlain?
So my father was indeed Lord Chamberlain to the Queen. He's not himself an aristocrat, but the title is an ancient title. Used to come with all sorts of weird roles, like being the chief censor of the theatre. But essentially what it sort of boiled down to in the modern era is chief of staff to the monarch. The sort of manager, as it were, of the royal household. And he did this job having been a professional politician for many years. And I guess he'd been in the equivalent of the State Department, the Foreign Office, and he'd been the accompanying government minister on royal visits to various parts of the world. And so I guess she got to know him during the 1980s when he was in politics. And that's why he was offered that job later in his career. But it is a pretty unusual job. And I often have to people think I was raised in something resembling Downton Abbey. I sort of have to point out to people, no, it's the same place my dad still lives in. It's got 5 bedrooms. It's a nice house, but it's kind of modest. It's not Downton Abbey. There are no liveried servants. There's no valets. There's no chauffeurs. There's no stables.
Now, for a number of years, he was a conservative member of the House of Commons. And then, what do they call it when you're in the House of Lords? He was was he a cross member? Is that what they call it?
Yes, crossbencher. So if you become Lord Chamberlain, this very unusual job, you automatically become a peer of the realm, as the term goes, which means you get a seat in the House of Lords. But convention dictates that you must renounce any partisan affiliation because you're there by virtue of serving the monarchy, and the monarchy is above politics. And although the British Constitution's not written, or at least not written in a single document in a single century, this is the very clear principle since the late 17th century. The monarch is supposedly above politics. And so he was in the House of Lords, and I think he just sort of he doesn't really attend it anymore because I think COVID put him off. Having debates on Zoom, just not his thing.
Let's get into your book, and I'm going to not go right straight to the foreign policy stuff so much as some of the stories you tell. The one that got my attention, I know it was told before, I'd never heard it, was on page 329, the Ayatollah and the Pope, and you lead off with this June 3rd, 1980 story about what?
So this was one of three false nuclear alerts that occurred during the Carter administration. There were several more, a very famous one during the Reagan years, but this was the hairiest of the three that Brzezinski faced. He was called at 2-3 a.m. By his military aide, Colonel Bill Odom, and told that there were 220 Soviet ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, heading towards the United States. 30 minutes warning time. And under the protocol, he had, I think, 7 minutes to tell President Carter, and for President Carter then to produce what his decision would be in response. About 3 minutes later, Odom called back, said, "Sorry, sir, this was a mistake. There are actually 2,000 ICBMs heading towards the United States." And so Brzezinski said, "Thank you," put the phone back down, was preparing his advice to Carter, which was to scramble all the jets and give the Soviets back as good as they got. This was essentially the end of the human story as we know it. Or at least that's what he thought. And made the decision not to wake his 3 children or his wife, who were there at home with him in McLean, Virginia, because he didn't want to ruin their last 30 minutes of life. And then he was about to call Carter, and Odom called back a third time, said this was a computer error in Cheyenne, Wyoming, in one of the silos that a training tape had been put in. And so he never called Carter. But things came pretty close to sort of Armageddon kind of scenario there. And as a person, you write a biography, you're really looking at the person behind the public figure as much as anything else. And it was his sort of complete calm, and he recorded it pretty matter-of-factly in his diary, just his sort of sang-froid about what he was facing, and a complete clarity of mind, whether you sort of agree with his retaliatory impulse or not. Very clear what he was going to recommend the president to do. And it happened again, but not quite such a close call the next time. But it's a very arresting story.
You tell us in your book, of course, it came from Politico in 2013 from a man named Charles, I don't know if I pronounce it right, Gatti?
Yes, absolutely. Charles Gatti.
Who was he?
Well, so actually the story is also recorded in the personal diary that Brzezinski would every evening, when he was on the way home from the White House, he would speak into a dictaphone, which people did in those days, for about half an hour. It was about a half an hour journey, and he would recount the day's events And that would then get typed up by an assistant later on and sort of filed away. These were his sort of hugely bulky, very detailed personal diaries. And he does recount that story in the diary. But Charles Gatti, who was a colleague originally from Columbia University, where they both taught, and kind of a protege of Brzezinski's. He was a Hungarian immigrant. Of course, Brzezinski was a Polish immigrant. He was kind of pretty much Brzezinski's closest friend, or one of his 2 or 3 closest friends. So he had a lot of stories. But he told that story to Politico when Brzezinski was alive, in fact, in 2013. Brzezinski died in 2017. And it was something Brzezinski would tell people, but not in any sort of great detail. He didn't consider it to be that interesting. People thought it was interesting, so he told them.
Brzezinski did, I just need a quick capsule of his life. What drew you to the story in the first place?
So I had got to know Brzezinski. I moved back to Washington in 2006 for the Financial Times. And he was just an extraordinary person to be able to talk to as a journalist about anything, really, geopolitical, foreign policy, Iraq war, whatever it might be you wanted to talk to him about. He had, I think, a pretty unique brain, ability to cut through detail to the heart of the matter, whether his conclusions were controversial or not. That clarity of thought really stood out. So he was a brilliant person for me as a journalist to talk to. And I got to know him quite well for a journalist and an interviewee over the last 11 years of his life. And after he died, about a year after he died, his family came to me, his children, and said, look, if you want to have his diaries, his private diaries, these what I call Tolstoyan, because they're so sort of sweeping and historical and long, without any strings attached. This offer was, they weren't going to make me an authorized biographer for a gun for hire. Then you can have them if you would like to sort of use that as a building block for a biography. And I started reading them, and the 1970s was a very interesting decade, which has sort of some echoes in the world we live today. And I got hooked pretty quickly. And then there's just the other side of it, which is a biography is a story. And it's as close as nonfiction gets to being novelistic. And therefore, your storytelling, pace-setting challenge as a writer was for me an additional sort of excitement. But really, the storied quality of his life, the very American story of Brzezinski, very American, of the American century, just gripped me. I thought it's an immensely exciting thing to do, and I'd never done a biography before, and I love a challenge, and this really was a very different kind of project than one I'd ever done before. I'm still excited about it, and I finished writing, more than a year ago, 18 months ago.
He was the national security advisor for Jimmy Carter for 4 years. And you contrast him constantly through the book with Cyrus Vance. Can you describe, for somebody that really has never thought it through, the difference between a national security advisor and where they sit physically, and the Secretary of State and where he sat, and what was the difference between these two men?
Yeah, and it's a very key, locational advantage that the National Security Advisor has if there's going to be a rivalry with the Secretary of State. And generally there is. Usually there is. Famously, the joke goes, the only time there wasn't was when Kissinger held both jobs. Now, of course, Marco Rubio holds both jobs. And so presumably he's not feeling rivalry with himself. But generally speaking, if there is rivalry, the National Security Advisor usually sits a few feet from the Oval Office and has a lot more access daily to the president. And of course, it depends on the National Security Advisor, and it depends on the president. But Carter and Brzezinski would begin their day with Brzezinski briefing Carter alone. Every single day, barring Sundays, or if Brzezinski or Carter happened to be traveling and the other wasn't. But generally, if the president was traveling, Brzezinski was traveling with him. Cy Vance is 1.5 miles away from the Secretary of State in Foggy Bottom, which is, it's not that far, but only compared to 30 feet or whatever it is, it's an ocean away. Would see the president probably typically 4 or 5 times a week, Brzezinski 4 or 5 times a day. So there was a sort of inbuilt disadvantage to Vance in this vying for influence at the president's ear. And the president was quite torn between Vance's more, I'd say, diplomatic, let's try and get along with the Soviets. Let's try and just establish a modus vivendi with them because they're here to stay. And we've got to remove the threat of nuclear war. We need to get a nuclear deal at all costs. Everything else should be subordinate to that. And Brzezinski thought, well, a nuclear deal would be okay, but not on Soviet terms and not at the expense of everything else. And what he saw as everything else was there was a lot of Soviet adventurism going on in Central America, the Middle East. They invaded Afghanistan, of course, late in the administration, very nearly invaded Poland. And Brzezinski, through location, partly, but also through events, what the Soviets were actually doing, eventually got the better of the argument. I think Carter, a few times himself, said that Vance had his heart, but Brzezinski had his head. And so by really the last 18 months, 2 years of the Carter administration, Carter's foreign policy was by and large a Brzezinski foreign policy. And Vance was one of the last of the sort of old WASP gentlemen, very, very decent man. And I'm not saying Brzezinski wasn't, but Brzezinski played by tougher rules. He was more of a Machiavellian figure. And I don't think Vance was really any match for him in that regard.
Please excuse us for interrupting. We'll continue our conversation in a minute. When did Cy Vance get the maddest at something that Brzezinski did?
So I think there was a moment in late 1978 where there was basically a race on for Vance to conclude what was known as the SALT II negotiations, and that is the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. There had been a SALT I in the Nixon era, negotiated by Henry Kissinger. And this was a few years later, and it was Vance's overwhelming priority. But Brzezinski was pursuing, at Carter's initially reluctant license, but then increasingly enthusiastic support, Brzezinski was pursuing normalization with China as a move to, really put the Soviets on the defensive on 2 fronts, an Eastern Front as well as a Western Front. And Vance saw that as a direct threat to the conclusion of SALT II. He thought the Soviets would see it as a sort of act of aggression and therefore walk away from the nuclear negotiating table. And so he was trying to wrap up the negotiations before Christmas of that year, knowing full well that Deng Xiaoping, China's leader, had agreed to visit the United States and normalize the following February, only a few weeks away. And Vance wanted SALT II concluded first, and he wanted a summit between Carter and the Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, before there was any meeting between the Chinese premier and Carter. And Brzezinski calls Vance in Geneva to say that this deal that you've got, this was a very abstruse but important aspect of the deal, was basically verification, telemetry, to say that this wasn't nearly tight enough and you've got to go back to the Soviets and you've got to renegotiate. And Vance did this and then came back again, and Brzezinski consulted with Carter. Carter said, no, tell him to do it again. And he realized at this point the Soviets were going to walk away, and they did. They walked away for about 3 months. And at this point, Vance was close to mutiny. I think it was described as one of his aides, just absolutely catatonic, sort of speechless with rage. But he was ultimately a team player. He came back. He was there for Deng Xiaoping's visit. And the Soviets did come back to the negotiating table. And in a way, funnily enough, the China normalization incentivized them to do that. So it didn't quite work as Vance saw it. But there were so many points at which Vance and Brzezinski really clashed. And so that's just one example. But over the Iran hostage crisis, and here Vance was very much in the right, Vance saw the flaws in this sort of Rube Goldberg rescue mission, Operation Eagle Claw, that Brzezinski was really pushing very hard. Vance was the only person close to Carter who had serious combat experience from the Second World War. And Vance was deeply, rightly, as it turned out, skeptical that this 48-hour, really complicated, multi-stage rescue plan could actually work. And it was at that point he did resign. He'd threatened to resign many times, but this time he really did resign. And all that Carter managed to do was to get him to agree to withhold the public announcement of his resignation until after the rescue attempt. And that is what happened. But it was rather a sad end, you know, to a very sort of noble and public-spirited career, but one where he was increasingly sort of the loser.
And some people may remember the name Cy Vance Jr., who has been the district attorney up in New York City until he stepped down some time ago before the lawsuit against the current president. You surfaced a story that happened in, I think it was 1980. I'm not sure because there's not it was on December the 19th. I know that. You can tell me what the year was. And he got the Sally Quinn treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And the Sally Quinn treatment, I've been in this town a long time, is usually very, very rough. Why did you use that? I'm going to read some of it so people can see, but give us the background on why you used it and what it meant to Brzezinski at the time.
So she did, I think, a 3-part profile. I mean, as you rightly say, she's a legendary Washington figure, still around, still writing, lives a few blocks from me as it happens, and was very helpful to me when I was researching this book. She wrote a pretty sort of expertly, incisively targeted hatchet job of Brzezinski. It was a real character assassination. She really, really was going for the jugular. And a lot of it was fair comment, and there was a lot of reporting in there. There's quite a few quotes that are unattributed in there that do sound terribly like Henry Kissinger. And it's all sort of fair in love and war to this point. But then she alleges that he did something sort of sexually perverted, basically, which is that he'd allegedly, in a session in the Oval Office of all places, where he was being pictured for some interview, and interviewed by a female journalist, that he had unzipped his fly and made some obscene gesture. And that, furthermore, there was a picture to back this up. And when that came out, it just caused a sensation. And it was December the 19th, 1979. Lloyd Cutler and others, Lloyd Cutler being the senior counsel for President Carter, got on the phone to Ben Bradley, the publisher of the Washington Post, and said there is no picture, there is no evidence. The female reporter in question denies. They'd sort of done all their work and sewn this up and demanded a retraction. And the following day, I think uniquely, there was a front page retraction, a very lengthy front page retraction. And, you know, to be fair to Sally Quinn, she said she probably, I can't remember the exact words she used, and I do sort of cite them in the book, but she said she probably misinterpreted and went a little bit over the top. I mean, you know, it was not her finest hour, and she could do some really, really, I mean, she was a very sort of precise, kind of often very acerbic writer. I think this one miscued quite badly. But it was a major event in the Brzezinski household. This is not good for a marriage to have your husband alleged to be behaving like that.
My memory is that was Claire Crawford at Time Magazine was the woman who actually wrote the piece.
Correct.
About the backup piece to what Sally Quinn said. Let me read what Sally Quinn said, quotes that she had in her piece, and have you give us the background on this. You write this. There were also a couple of devastating on-the-record takedowns of Brzezinski. Now the quotes. He's a very, very arrogant, self-opinionated man, said the Republican senator and former presidential candidate Barry Goldwater. He should be my kind of guy, but he is arrogant with a capital A. From former Democratic presidential candidate George McGovern, I endorse Barry. The unsourced quotes portrayed Brzezinski as a man who craved the limelight and had no real agenda other than to put his name in lights. His real goal was to become Secretary of State. Quote, Zbig has always been in a position where he has left an enormous need to attract attention that came to Henry, normally, that's Henry Kissinger. Tell us more about all those quotes and what they mean.
So this was a period of real Brzezinski notoriety and unpopularity. There'd just been the Cuba Brigade crisis, which turned out to be nothing about nothing. But it really did dominate the headlines for weeks and weeks. The CIA had basically missed there was a Soviet brigade in Cuba. And Brzezinski took a very hawkish line on this, even though it was no new news there. He had sharp elbows, Brzezinski. In contrast to sort of Henry Kissinger, he did not butter up journalists. That's to put it mildly. He wasn't particularly good at diplomacy with Capitol Hill either. And so when the chips were down for him, people would come out, and they came out for that Sally Quinn piece, which is why, in the absence of that sort of story that prompted the retraction, it might have been a pretty devastating piece. Brzezinski was particularly unpopular on the left of the Democratic Party and with the media, and I think there was a lot of overlap in worldview. McGovern, for example, as you know, was the Democratic nominee in 1972, and Brzezinski was cited as being a member of McGovern's advisory team in the Washington Post. And he wrote a letter to the Washington Post correcting that and saying, I am not an advisor. I do not support McGovern's policies. He almost certainly voted for Nixon in 1972. So he was not a Democratic loyalist. He didn't belong to sort of clear factions or groups or cliques. And so he didn't have a sort of natural support base, other than like the many thousands of students he taught over the years, who are mostly sort of extremely fond and admiring of him. Politically, he had no real base, other than Carter's in enormous trust he placed in him. And so he made himself pretty unpopular. I mean, I think his insouciance, his not caring or not seeming to care about unpopularity is in some respects a bit of a superpower. I can think of people in politics who really crave to be liked, and that can be a weakness. And in a way, Kissinger, in some respects, does fit that description. But Brzezinski went out of his way to sort of, if he saw a fool, he wouldn't pretend he wasn't talking to a fool. He could what I call it sort of verbal decapitation. He made enemies where he shouldn't have, where a wiser, maybe older Brzezinski would not have done. And Quinn brought that out in that piece, but that's not what we remember the piece for. We remember it really for the retraction.
You give us an interesting background on his memoir and who helped him write it. Who did, and how did that happen?
So one of the things he did do very well, Brzezinski, was spot talent and recruit it. to work for him at the National Security Council. So Bob Gates, was a protege. And Madeleine Albright was another. He poached Madeleine Albright from Senator Ed Muskie's office, ironically another Polish American. And Albright jokingly said she was going from pole to pole. He made her the first legislative sort of liaison officer for the National Security Council because she knew Capitol Hill very well, and she really was Brzezinski's tutor. You've got to go to the Hill to talk to them. They don't come to you because they're elected and you're not. She had to really sort of school him in this. And if you disagree, don't say you're wrong, Senator. Say, oh, that's a very interesting point of view, Senator, but here's another thing you might consider. So she really gave him a crash course in the art of how to talk to people in politics. But she'd also been his PhD student at Columbia in the 1960s. So he'd known her for quite a long time. And she didn't just speak Czech from her native Czechoslovakia, but she also learned Polish. And she became his sort of his glorified assistant, I guess, after the Carter years, when he wrote this quite controversial memoir, Power and Principle. She was the one who sort of went through and got stuff declassified, and really, it was a controversial book because he does sort of settle scores, and he doesn't put his punches about the weaknesses of his colleagues, including Cyrus Vance, including Walter Mondale, the vice president. He doesn't come off well. Carter does, generally. Brzezinski comes off well. He was the author of this book. But it's a very well-researched book. I mean, it's also a really good history of the geopolitics of those years. Naturally, I think the reviewers, though, picked on those less than noble qualities, I think, in that book. But Albright was really, I think and she was very helpful to this biography, by the way, and tragically died by today's standards pretty young, about halfway through it. But I'd spent many hours with her, and I think Zbig was her mentor. I mean, she adored Zbig, and he really did sort of provide a rocket boost to her career. And, of course, she ended up being the first female Secretary of State.
By the way, the first ever interview on a program that we had here on C-SPAN called Booknotes. This is Booknotes Plus, and it's just a podcast. That program started on April the 2nd, 1989, and the first ever guest, we had 800 guests, was Zbigniew Brzezinski. And next week's podcast, we're going to run that interview so people can hear him talk about communism. And it's the book, The Grand Failure, which I'm sure you read. I want to ask you about Madeleine Albright, because didn't she end up getting quite irritated at Dr. Brzezinski later on when he didn't politically do the things that she thought he should do?
Yes, I mean, this is back to the sort of old story that he wasn't really a clubbable type. He wasn't a loyalist Democrat. He was a Democrat by merit, if you like. And he didn't like Michael Dukakis. He saw Michael Dukakis, the 1988 Democratic nominee, in much the same way, I think, that he had seen George McGovern in 1972, as essentially a naive, pretty unworldly neo-isolationist, sort of liberal isolationist. And Madeleine Albright happened to be his foreign issues director, so she was his chief foreign affairs person. And Brzezinski not only didn't endorse Dukakis, but he became the co-chair with, for the first and last time, Henry Kissinger of the Bush senior 1988 presidential campaign. And I don't think he gave Albright a heads up. So she was taken by surprise about this. They had a period of, I'd say, sort of Siberian relations for a year or two after that. But they did make up. And then when she was Secretary of State, in fact, he was very helpful to her, and I guess vice versa, in the first NATO expansion, which included Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. So they became friends again. And
in the section where you write about Madeleine Albright, you also have this person that I'm about to quote from your book was the Deputy Secretary of State for a while. He's no longer alive, Strobe Talbot. But you say here, and so meanwhile, he was Time magazine reporter. Strobe Talbot thought Brzezinski's memoir offered yet more evidence of his weakness for glibness and gobbledygook. More damningly, he added, Brzezinski does not seem to realize how often his candor, when directed at others, looks like malice, and when directed at himself, looks like shameless egotism.
Yeah.
Did they have any relationship at all, the Strobe Talbot and Brzezinski?
Yeah, Talbot was foremost among quite a large contingent of journalists who were very critical of Brzezinski, and close to people around Vance. By the way, people like Hodding Carter, the State Department spokesman, Richard Holbrooke, and several figures, Marshall Shulman, several figures. Not Vance himself. Vance himself never briefed against Brzezinski, never leaked, but people around him did. And so Talbot was not in any way unusual in being so vituperative in how critical he was of Brzezinski. It's an interesting relationship, though, because in 1989, I think probably about 6 months after that first podcast you did with, that first interview that C-SPAN did there in that series, he was invited to Moscow. This book, Grand Failure, which was really, it's what I call it. I mean, so it's a very elegant and extremely sort of effective funeral for the communist experiment, for the Soviet communist experiment. It's why it failed. And it became a very influential book. It was as good a book as his memoir wasn't, if you like, from a few years earlier. And he invited Talbot on this trip. There was a whole delegation. Charles Gatti, in fact, was the head of the delegation, but Brzezinski was the star. And Brzezinski was invited into the inner sanctum, if you like, which is the Soviet Diplomatic Academy. Foreigners really weren't allowed to go in there. And so this was a big breaking of precedent. And he was invited to speak. They didn't ask him in advance to say what he was going to speak about, what the content, to the senior party leadership and the sort of upper echelons of the Soviet government. Packed. Brzezinski was a notorious figure in the Soviet Union. I mean, they sort of ascribed to him almost sort of superhuman negative powers, partly because of his Polishness, that he has to hate us. And he gave this speech in which he said, look, I like Gorbachev, and what Gorbachev, the last Soviet leader, is trying to do is very noble, but what Gorbachev's trying to do is to say Stalinism was bad, Stalin was awful, but Lenin was good. And he said, that's just not possible. And he said this very clearly. Spoke partly in Russian, partly in English. Spoke very, very bluntly. It's like, Stalin would not have been possible without Lenin. You cannot keep the bathwater. You've got to throw the baby out with the bathwater and scrap your system. It has been a failure. Here have been the costs of it. Here have been... And he finished speaking, and there was silence. Strobe Talbot was, of course, in the audience listening. Silence for a minute or two, and then absolutely wild standing ovation. And Talbot then interviewed Brzezinski after this. A lot of the Americans, this is actually before the Berlin Wall comes down, but a lot of the Americans there who I spoke to, many of them still alive, such as Gatti, said it was then they realized, the Cold War's totally over. It's like, now we really know it. This is just not coming back, this system. And Talbot did this interview with Brzezinski, in which the headline was, it's a Time magazine, and so headline was "Vindication of a Hardliner," and it was actually a pretty big gesture of Talbot, knowing what his history had been with Brzezinski, and I think they got along pretty well after that. But Brzezinski did invite him along as on this trip he wanted Talbot to see, and Talbot, to give him his full due, understood exactly what he saw, and that it was a vindication, at least of that aspect, that very important aspect of Brzezinski's career, which was how to deal with the Soviet Union.
Please excuse us for interrupting. We'll continue our conversation in a minute. You tell us a lot about his family. You point out that he has a son that's a Republican, one that's a Democrat, and a daughter that probably most people have heard of, who is married to Joe Scarborough and on Morning Joe. What was it like in the Brzezinski family growing up?
Pretty tough. You know, I mean, I felt like a bit like the sort of Grand Inquisitor, Torquemada or somebody, you know. I mean, the intrusiveness of a biographer is like you're asking really personal questions to people about private things. What was your dad like? And, you know, and they're sort of made available, not just his his official diaries, but love letters between his parents when they were courting in Harvard in the 50s, and some poems that they exchanged, and all kinds of stuff that are very important for a biography. But they were really candid about, you know, I think he was a pretty difficult father, to be blunt, quite a demanding, quite an exacting father, not a disciplinarian. You know, I don't think he was one for sort of punishments. He believed in the power of argument, but he could be pretty relentless. And not many people sort of matched up to Brzezinski's intellectual standards. And as I said, he would take no prisoners. And it's one thing if you're Bob Gates and you are disputing your boss's view of, I don't know, the Sinai desert or something. It's quite another, you know, if you're a 14-year-old boy in middle school, or you know, a 12-year-old girl who's not particularly interested in academics, or at that point at all interested. And they would have debates every evening over dinner. He would sort of propose a motion, like, you know, should abortion be legal, or should we abolish the death penalty, or are the Soviets, is the Soviet Union reformable? It's like, this is not your average TV dinner family. And their mother, wonderful woman, Muska, as she became known, born like Madeleine Albright, came from a Czech family, was actually born in Switzerland, but grew up Czech-speaking, and like Brzezinski, crossed the Atlantic in her youth. Both of them were kind of old world, Central European, fairly upper class Central European. And so this was not, you know, when Mark, Ian, and Mika looked at their peers at their schools in Virginia, this was not sort of typical of the parenting, to put it mildly, that their peers went through. But each in their own way has had a pretty distinctive path in life. Mika, as you say, I mean, she's the best known. She's kind of a TV celebrity, Morning Joe co-host. But, you know, Ian served in several Republican administrations. Mark Brzezinski, the middle offspring, was Biden's ambassador to Poland, for example. He was Obama's ambassador to Sweden. I mean, they've had pretty distinguished careers so far. But it wasn't because their sort of upbringing was overflowing with praise. I mean, you know, praise was a very scarce commodity in the Brzezinski household, and indeed in the Brzezinski lecture hall.
Before World War II, I mean, he was born in Poland and lived there for 10 years, but before World War II, there were 3.5 million Jews in Poland. Today, it's somewhere around 17,000. What would Dr. Brzezinski say about Poland and what happened to the Jews and the fact that they didn't come back to the country?
So it's a very, somebody asked me the other day, and I was surprised that I didn't know the answer as to what Brzezinski's view was to the term Polish death camps. Because I know what Brzezinski's views are on all aspects of Poland, including what happened to its Jewish population, the absolutely near total annihilation Polish Jews. And so, the fact that most of the killing machines were located in Poland, and Nazi Germany had concentration camps, but not death camps, or not mass scale ones, is an extreme sensitive topic to Polish governments of all political varieties, and they get very they take umbrage when anybody uses the term Polish death camps. It's a perfectly reasonable description, the fact that these death camps were in Poland. And I suppose that, because Poland does have a pretty sort of notorious history itself of anti-Semitism, there's a double sensitivity there. I don't know what Brzezinski would have said about that sort of naming dispute. I do know that he was, profoundly ashamed of Poland's record of anti-Semitism, including after the Second World War. I mean, there was a notorious pogrom by Poles of Polish Jews in 1946, I believe, after the Nazis had been defeated. And then, there were horrible sort of terms imposed on the few thousand, about, a few tens of thousands of Polish Jews left, basically stripping them of their assets if they wanted to leave the country and emigrate to Israel or the United States. Basically a punitive exit tax. So a sort of shameful, postscript to the whole story. I know he was deeply ashamed of that, and constantly surprised to learn things. He wrote a lot to his father, who'd been a Polish diplomat, in Polish, but I got those letters all translated. There's quite a few passages there expressing anguish and, I guess, shame at Poland's record.
You had a couple of words in this book that I've got to ask you about. And one of them I'd never seen before, and I needed to ask you why you used it. Very simple. Carter's Grangrindian urge. Where does the word Grangrindian come from?
So Gradgrind was a Dickens character, a Charles Dickens character. And he had quite a sort of joyless, humorless approach to how life should be lived, which was to just work hard from dawn until dusk. And pleasure was kind of immoral, or distraction was immoral. And there was a facet to Carter's character that was pretty sort of, Gradgrind was a Protestant sort of caricature. Dickens was as you know, him, the master of caricature. So Gradgrindian is a term that I suppose it's more in use, not actually that much in use anymore in Britain, but doesn't really occur in American English. So it probably slipped through the net. I'm surprised Simon & Schuster didn't question me about it, but it got through.
So it's Grangrindian, not Grangrindian.
Yeah, Gradgrindian or Grindian.
It's amazing how. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I actually don't know whether it's Gradgrindian or Gradgrindian. I think it's Gradgrindian because that's how it should sound. Grind. It should be onomatopoeic.
I must say it's amazing how often books, serious books, and over the years I've interviewed authors, has something Dickens in the book somewhere. So your fellow Brits have done a good job for us all by having Dickens up front all the time. Talk about the diaries, please. How much was there, and how much of it did you read? And you mentioned it earlier, what it was like, but what did you find there?
Well, so there are a lot of diary. I mean, in terms of sort of thousands of pages, maybe it's a couple of thousand pages. I'll have to go back and check, or maybe more. But I don't know, I read all of it several times. And then sort of cross-tabulated with actual events and stuff where there are official memos or media reports at the time. So it's an incredibly useful resource. It was, I guess, a sort of first draft of history. And Brzezinski was a very articulate man. He spoke in fully formed paragraphs. I think he had many sort of, well, he had some pretty abrasive qualities, but he wasn't a dishonest person. I don't really trust, I know that he's taking his slant, but I don't ever see sort of invention or fantasy or that. I think he had high integrity as a character. So, and the sort of cross-checking of, the diaries against other sources to corroborate usually bore out Brzezinski's, if not interpretation, certainly his account of what happened. And so they're an immensely useful resource for a biographer. I mean, there were other diaries. He was a sort of pretty relentless diarist, and he and Carter does mention this. He was the one who convinced Carter to keep a diary. And Carter's diaries, they've only been published in part. I believe only about 20% of them are actually published. So there's still 80% that's, controlled by the Carter estate that hasn't yet been made public. But Brzezinski sort of evangelized. The evangelism went in the reverse direction with keeping diaries. He persuaded Carter that it's a really good habit to get into, and he followed it all his life. So I benefited. It was a real windfall for a biographer. From his diaries from age 11, he started keeping a diary age 11. After he'd crossed the Atlantic to the New World, he began to keep a diary in Polish. And of course, I got them all translated. And he mostly continued on until 1981. There were a few years where he stopped, and he kind of switches to English midway through the 50s. When he's at Harvard, he begins to sort of stop doing his diaries in Polish. But he was a pretty faithful, regular diarist. And for a biographer, that's a windfall. I mean, it's just a lot more difficult. It might have been more typical in those days. It's very untypical nowadays.
I went through your book and listed a whole bunch of people. I'm going to just take the time for those who are interested. There's a lot more. We haven't even touched the surface of all the issues in here. And I told you when we started, I was going to spend a lot of time on the person. But on the National Security Council side, you had David Aaron, Robert Hunter, Madeleine Albright, Bill Oldham, Gerald Schechter. You had Jessica Tuckman, Barbara Tuckman's daughter. Her name is Matthews. Robert Gates and Rick Endefers, who also went on to work for ABC News. Then on the Cy Vance side, you had Richard Holbrook, Tony Lake, Les Gelb, Marshall Schulman, Paul Warnke, and Harding Carter III. And you point out that you suspected that Harding Carter III was the leaker for Cy Vance from the State Department. What's a leaker?
A leaker is actually a little bit of a loose term, because you can have an authorized leaker and an unauthorized leaker. Now, Zbig's shop, as they called it, the National Security Council, famously had no unauthorized leaks. And he gave really frank weekly briefings to them where he gave them all the classified stuff they needed. And they felt a sort of real group identity. And he said, if any of this leaks out, I will stop doing this. I will stop sharing stuff with you. And nobody leaked. And, I interviewed, it's remarkable how many people who work for Brzezinski are still alive and very, very active, and were very, very keen to help, to be interviewed. And there was just no instance where Brzezinski suspected leaks. He himself authorized himself to leak. So it was kind of a mirror image of the State Department, because Vance was a sort of, he was from the old Henry Stimson school, which was gentlemen do not read other people's mail. That was sort of the Vance ethic, the old WASP ethic. So he didn't leak, and he didn't approve of leaking. And he really tried to stop it from happening. But Harding Carter, Les Gelb, Richard Holbrook in some instances, and one or two, not so much Marshall Schulman, those three in particular, were pretty happy leakers. I don't think Anthony Lake was much of a leaker. But they, it was a mirror image, really, of how the NSC worked, how the NSC and state. And so there were lots of sort of wild leaks against Brzezinski going, some accurate, some inaccurate. But there was a lot of making use of the media for this battle between state, over genuine policy differences, it should be emphasized, for this battle between state and the White House.
You mentioned that a number of people are still alive. Actually, I looked it up, and David Aaron's alive at 87, Robert Hunter at 85, Madeleine Albright's deceased. A lot of folks are. Jessica Tuckman Matthews is 79, Robert Gates is 81, Rick Endefurth is 78, and Tony Lake is 80. I don't need to go on with that, but it's interesting how many people are still with us. Let me ask you the last couple questions. How many years, I'm going to ask you 2 or 3 so you don't have to go back and forth, but how many years did it take to write this? Where did you write it? And when along the way did you do, I didn't know that?
Well, I started researching it really in 2020, and I finished writing it in, I guess I started researching more like late 2019, and I finished writing it in April, May 2024. So it's about 4.5 years of research. The actual physical writing, was only about 6 months of that process. And I was doing a day job, as I still am, my day job for the Financial Times all through that period. I did take some leaves of absence, several leaves of absence, which I added to vacation. We're a London-based employer, so we have slightly more generous vacation sort of leave in our contracts. And if you add that to the unpaid leave available, and the FT is very supportive, actually. They weren't dying to pay me when I took leave, but they're very supportive about giving you leave. And weekends and evenings. You don't do biography by halves. You've got to do it properly or not at all. And it's really hard to narrow down what I there were so many times I thought I did not know that. So many things I didn't know. It was such a sort of journey of self-education as much as anything else. And the sort of net has to be cast so wide to understand all the contexts and explain all the contexts in which Brzezinski's operating that, it was just a continual, very deep, immersive learning experience for me.
And you've been talking to us from London today, which is 5 hours ahead of us, I guess, at this point. But are you an American citizen, British citizen, and you live here in DC or over in London?
So I'm based in DC. I'm just here for a couple of work-related events, and I do come back to London quite a lot. I am a green card holder. I have been for several years. I became eligible to apply for citizenship just as COVID was beginning, and I realized there was absolutely no point in applying. Everything was grinding to a halt. And I really should get my act together and apply for citizenship. So thank you for reminding me.
The name of the book is Zbig, for Zbigniew Brzezinski, and it's the life of Zbigniew Brzezinski, America's great power prophet. And our guest has been Edward Luce of the Financial Times. Thank you, sir, for your time and your book.
It was an absolute delight. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.